Powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. This is Football at 4.
And Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Geoff Mosher's in the house today. Jeff will join us in about 5 to 10 minutes from now. He got tied up a little bit for today's appearance, but there's a lot of football I want to talk about before Moshe gets here anyway. And one of the things is over at ESPN.com, the 10 best quarterbacks in the NFL, executive coaches and scouts, they put the list together. They came up with the 10 very best in the NFL. We're going to talk to Moshe about his thoughts on that coming up. But the big story really over the weekend was DeAndre Hopkins. He signs with the Tennessee Titans. And we already did our division previews of the AFC South. I'm wondering, what does adding DeAndre Hopkins to the Tennessee Titans do for that team? How much does that change the complexion of the division? You know, how many people think a guy like Hopkins, you know, wide receivers are really interesting. They go from like 0 to 60 pretty quickly. DeAndre Hopkins played with terrible quarterback play in Houston for years, right? For years, they had no quarterback to throw him the football, and he was still one of the best football receivers in all of football. Now, I agree. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, wow, you've got Ryan Tannehill there, and he's going to just all of a sudden take DeAndre Hopkins to another level. But what does he bring to that offense? The Tennessee Titans. Think about this now. You've got Derrick Henry and DeAndre Hopkins now on the same team that you got to deal with. Does that really change the complexion of the Tennessee Titans? Does it put them in a completely different conversation? Or are you still kind of meh about the Titans? You got Tannehill, you got Henry, you got Hopkins, Treylon Burks. Remember, he was a first-round draft choice there. Their offensive line, that left side's kind of interesting. They signed Andre Dillard from the Eagles. They drafted Peter Skronsky, the Northwestern offensive lineman. So that left side of the line is kind of taken care of over there. All of a sudden, I remember we were talking about them last week, and we were talking about Vrabel as a head coach. And I said, I think he does more with less. Does he now have an offense that makes you intrigued? Here's another name I think you got to keep an eye on. They got Tannehill, they got Henry, they got Hopkins. I think Taj Spears is another player. They drafted him out of Tulane. I think he's going to be a fun little toy to play with for this Tennessee offense. If Hopkins can still play at the level that he was in Houston, he did not have a great year last year. He was banged up, 64 catches, 717 yards, and 3 touchdowns last year in Arizona. But if he can get back to the guy, now that's the big question. He's been in the league now. This is going to be his, I believe, 10th season in the NFL. His last 3 years, 2 of the last 3, he has been hurt. So are we starting to see a guy where that's the problem? You know, remember, I always go back to Julio Jones. Julio Jones was like the best receiver we had in the league for a 10-year run, and then he just wasn't anymore, and to the point where, yeah, he just stunk. In Houston, though, he had a 1,400-yard year, a 1,200-yard year, a 1,500-yard year, 1,400-yard, 1,500, 1,200-yard. You're talking about one of the elite players in the game for a stretch there, and he had terrible quarterback play. I would surmise, now he played with Watson, right? He played with Watson that last year in Houston, 2019?
Hopkins, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, Hopkins played with Watson, yes.
How many years did he play with Watson?
I want to say 3.
What year was Watson drafted? Was it 17 or 18?
It was the same draft as Mahomes.
So that was the 2018 draft, I want to say.
Maybe 17, because wasn't Trubisky number 2 that year?
Yeah, but 2017, that was the year the Eagles won the Super Bowl, and Mahomes was the pick in Philadelphia at the draft. So was that the
2017, Watson was the 12th overall pick.
So 2017, he played with Watson then for 3 years. Those 3 years, he had 1,300 yards and 13 touchdowns, 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns. and then 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. When he went to Arizona the first year, he had 1,400 yards with Kyler Murray. And then he got hurt the next 2 and basically kind of, he got hurt in 2021. He still had 8 touchdowns that year. I mean, so I'm really intrigued at who Watson Hopkins is. You know what I'm saying? Like, does this move really move the needle and change the dynamics for the Tennessee Titans? I'll get Geoff Mosher's take on that and some other things as we bring him in now for another edition of Football at 4. We are 1 week and 1 day away from Eagles training camp. Tomorrow is Tuesday. The following Tuesday, Geoff Mosher, the Eagles will be reporting to camp. We are 8 days away. What's up, buddy?
What's up? We are 8 days away, and a lot of I honestly believe this. Well, of course I honestly believe this. I'm not a liar. I don't know why people say that. I think this Eagles training camp is going to be more exciting than most camps in the past. Now, it's, you can't hide the fact that the practices are still only about an hour, and, it's not like going to Lehigh anymore. But there will be joint practices that'll be fun. And when you look at the competitions they have, right, it's starting at the right guard, at the running back position, slot wide receiver, the chance to see Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter and all the rebuilt defense up the middle. I just think that there's a lot of great competition that's about to play itself out, honest competition where there really might not be a clear front runner, or even if there is, you may not have a really long leash. And that's what's going to make this year's camp a little bit different than I think the last 4, 5, 6, where they've kind of gotten a little bit mundane and obvious.
Yeah, you just mentioned, the fun training camp. You do have some battles. Right guard, that will be a battle. The running back thing, how that materializes. The slot receiver thing. Who's going to be those? I don't want to say, obviously, they're not battling for starting corner or slot corner, but what does that cornerback room look like? I think the safety battle, that's going to be definitely something. And then, of course, the linebacker room. And then, Moshe, how is that defensive line rotation going to start working itself out?
Yeah, I mean, starting with Jordan Davis and how much he's going to be able to be conditioned, and then where does Jalen Carter fit in? Where does Milton Williams fit in? They brought in Contavious Street. How quickly can Nolan Smith make an impact when you already have 3 pretty good edge rushers in front of him? So a whole lot's got to shake itself out. Plus Sean Desai, right? He's a new defensive coordinator, and you want to see what things that he brings to this defense.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention another battle that's going to be something to keep an eye on will be that second tight end. What's going to happen in that tight end room? We know Goddard is definitely the guy there, but then the rest of the crew after that, how that all kind of shakes itself out. And I don't know that there's a clear answer to that question on July 17th.
Well, I would probably say third tight end. I think Jack Stoll will still pretty much have a leg up over whoever's number 3. But to your point, you've got Grant Calcaterra, you have Tyree Jackson, right? And then they signed Dan Arnold. So that's 3 candidates for one job, and each one of them is unique in their own way. Dan Arnold has been a guy who's been a vertical threat tight end in this league as a rotational guy for quite a while. Tyree Jackson is a 6'7" freak of nature, to be honest with you, former Buffalo quarterback who, in our glimpses of seeing him, has done some pretty decent things. And then it's hard not to think of the potential of what he could be if he can stay healthy and put it together, and he can block a little bit. And of course, Grant Calcaterra was a guy who showed you last year some ability to find his way in the zones and make it happen. He's got some explosion to him. So all 3 are legitimate. It's going to be a legitimate battle there.
Geoff Mosher and Andrew DeCecco over at InsideTheBirds.com. They have a long series going on questions going to training camp. In part 10, you both went with the biggest concern for the Eagles. Andrew's was interesting. I kind of think that his is one that a lot of people talk about, but yours was a little outside the box.
It was a little outside. I thought, and by the way, I really liked Andrew's answer too, because he had chose the coordinators as the biggest team concern. That's the one you're talking about?
Yep.
Yeah, and that's a really good. And by the way, when we biggest concern, it doesn't mean we think it's going to be bad. It's just the area that you're probably not sure about. And obviously, the Eagles have 2 new play callers. One of them was from outside the organization, and Sean Desai. The other is Brian Johnson. And then, of course, a trickle-down effect that leaves with a new quarterbacks coach. But My answer was this. My concern is turnover production, because if you look at the Eagles last year, Mike, they were almost like two different teams at a time. The first 8 weeks of the season, they were doing great, but they weren't killing teams like 51-10. They were doing well, but they were winning games because they were flipping the field. You saw Chauncey Gardner-Johnson had that 5-game stretch where he had 6 interceptions. You remember the Minnesota game where Bradbury had the big pick on Kirk Cousins, like right deep into the with the Eagles backed up. I mean, they were just churning out historic. I don't know if it was historic, but they were number one in the league through 8 or 9 games, right? In turnover production, in turnover ratio. Then they went into that like little stretch after Gardner-Johnson got hurt where they started just kicking the crap out of teams. It was Pittsburgh and Tennessee and forget who else was in that mix, where they're just doing Giants, one blowout after another. And they were those games were defined by just coming out and throwing on these teams, going deep, getting those deep balls. We saw that against Pittsburgh. We saw that against Tennessee. We saw it against the Giants. But their turnover production wasn't as big in those games. It was more of a first half thing than a second half thing. And, I remember telling you during last year, I think that they were better in the first half of the year when maybe they weren't kicking the crap out of teams, but they were just flipping the field so much. That is so devastating. And, Mike, you saw it in the Super Bowl. 2 teams that are known for not turning the ball over. One team turned the ball over once. That was the Eagles. And that very much, like anything else, can be considered the biggest difference in a game that they lost, so close by 3 points, right? So I just don't know when you look at this team, right? Without Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and with new linebackers, new safeties, Terrell Edmonds has 5 career interceptions. That's less than Chauncey had last year in like 8 or 9 games. So I don't know from a personnel standpoint if they have the type of team that's going to flip the field as consistently as it did last year. And when you don't have that and you're playing a tougher schedule and you're playing these better quarterbacks, that can be difficult. Now, maybe a guy like Nakobe Dean will be that guy, or maybe Reed Blankenship, right? Or Sidney Brown. Maybe somebody does step up. Maybe Bradbury and Slay become a little bit more turnover creators. Slay used to be that 5 years ago. He had 8 interceptions and led the league. But someone's going to have to be for this defense.
Well, I guess, you create a lot of turnovers because you got to the quarterback so much. You also, even when you didn't sack the quarterback, you caused quarterback to hurry and throw the ball rush, and you wonder if you're going to get that same pass rush that you got last year. So if you don't have the same pass rush, are you going to be able to create the same amount of turnovers?
Right, and then going back to the confusion, the Fangio concept is to create confusion for the quarterback by using a lot of post-snap movement. Like the quarterback's looking at one defensive alignment, and then as soon as he snaps the ball, he realizes they're going from a cover 2 to a cover 1 or a cover 1 to a cover 3, something completely different. Do the Eagles early on have the personnel to execute that? The Steelers don't do a whole lot of that. That's where Edmonds comes from, right? Sidney Brown is just being indoctrinated into this defense. So, the corners should be used to it. But really from a safety and a linebacker level, those guys really used to moving before and after the snap. And when you have a bunch of new guys, I don't know how much Nick Morrow did that last year in Chicago or in his years with the Raiders.
Geoff Mosher, Football at 4, part 9 of your series. You guys had an interesting debate as well, and it had to do with the biggest individual concern for 2023. Yours is Jordan Davis. Tell us why you have some individual concern for him.
Yeah, it was kind of a hedge of the bet because I had at one point in the series, he was also my second-year breakout player. So, but he is still a concern because if he doesn't break out, this is going to have a widespread impact on the Eagles' run defense, especially. If he's not able to play at least, 40 to 50% of the defensive snaps, which would be an increase from last year, then how are the linebackers going to be kept clean? These light linebackers got to have that guy in front of them holding up blocks so that they can get cleanly to the lanes and make the tackles. And they don't really have another, just like last year, they're going into the year or going into camp without a natural backup nose tackle. Last year they had to sign Linval Joseph off the street. So we'll have to see what they do there. If Jordan Davis is not, much better than last year and able to play a lot of the game. I think they're going to have some issues fundamentally with what they want to do on defense.
Yeah, we're talking with Geoff Mosher, Football at 4. And one of the things, Jordan Davis, will be interesting to see how he's used this year. Is he going to have a different role this year? Or are they going to try to use him just in the same role but more?
Well, I mean, I think that you got to crawl before you walk. So he's got to be able to play that nose tackle position on first and second down, be good at it, be conditioned enough to then convince the coaches, hey, we should kind of move him into a 3 technique role in a 4-3 front when we're trying to rush the passer, because he can push the guard and the center back and make a lot of or he can push whoever's guarding him back and kind of pinch that pocket and make it even easier for guys like Hassan Reddick and Josh Sweat and maybe Nolan Smith, whoever's coming out from the edges, Fletcher Cox, right, to get their fair share of sacks.
Geoff, you guys also went to the offensive concern, biggest team concern for the offensive side of the ball. That was the defensive side of the ball. Your offensive side of the ball, Andrew went with the right guard spot, which, is self-explanatory. You're going to have a new guy in there who's basically going to be playing right guard, possibly for the first time if it's Cam Jurgens. But what about your pick, which is kind of an interesting one?
So this, if we are referring to today's story, this was more, I accidentally made an error in the opening graph. This was not biggest team concern. This was supposed to be best battle of camp. So, yes, Andrew picked right guard, which is best battle on offense in some people's eyes.
Well, I think the answer to the question would fit for probably both.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't really have a concern about the running backs. To me, it's just a great competition, and may the best and healthiest man win. And, I made the point in the story that I don't know if the Eagles have been this talented at running back from top to bottom since LaShawn McCoy's rookie year, which was 2009 when Brian Westbrook was still on the team. So you had McCoy, you had Westbrook, and like your number 3 back was Leonard Weaver that year, who was really a fullback, but he ran the ball a lot for a fullback. That was a really good top 3. And then before that, you'd have to go to that 2003 team. Remember the 3-headed monster back committee of Deuce Staley, Brian Westbrook, and Carell Ballcoulter? They ran for 2,000 yards. So you haven't had that much talent, but now you can say you do with Rashad Penny and DeAndre Swift and Trey Sermon and Kenneth Gainwell, who I think is going to have a bigger role in Boston Scott. That's 5 guys, Mike. 5 guys are not making this team. You're not having 5 running backs on the 53. So you can make the argument that not only one isn't going to make it, but maybe 2. And that's why I think this is going to be the most exciting competition of camp, because the name recognition involved here with DeAndre Swift and Penny and Gainwell. I mean, that's a really solid top 3 right there. Sermon is sort of this, curious type because the guys had 17 yards on 2 carries last year. I mean, certainly you saw something with him, and he was a 3rd-round pick. He was a great player at Ohio State, and even before that, Oklahoma State and then Ohio State. So it's going to be fun. Right guard is more significant, but running back's more fun to me to watch. If you're a fan, you're just like wondering how this thing's going to shake out.
Geoff, I want to get your take. We were talking about before you jumped on DeAndre Hopkins, obviously huge name. What does he have left in the tank for you, and how much does that change Tennessee now? Because a lot of teams you would think would be interested in a guy like him. It seemed like there wasn't a lot of interest in Hopkins, but does that change the fortunes for Tennessee at all for you, or do you kind of scratch your head and wonder what are they thinking?
No, I don't scratch my head at all about what they're thinking. I mean, the Titans are still in a sort of they're sort of in a mode as long as Derrick Henry's on the team, right? And Ryan Tannehill's the quarterback for now, then they're not giving up on a season. They're going to try to compete. Their defense is very good, starting with that front line of Jeffrey Simmons, right? But what they really needed was a playmaker in the wide receiver corps. Since trading A.J. Brown away, they didn't really have one. They drafted Treylon Burks. He looked pretty good as a rookie, but certainly not ready to just be a number 1 without much of a number 2 there. So now you got DeAndre Hopkins as your number 1. Treylon Burks can come into his second year and continue to do something, to grow on being a first-round pick. They got a good tight end, Mike. A lot of people don't know him or remember him, and I have trouble pronouncing his name. I know it's Chigo Okonkwo. That was my best guess.
Good effort.
We saw him last year. He's athletic, and he can catch the ball, and he can make run after the yards after the catch. And I think that they think he's sort of a guy who's really important to that offense that not a lot of people talk about. The offensive line lost some guys, so they'll have to make up there. But, when you got Derrick Henry, it makes your offensive line look a little better anyway. So they're trying to compete, and that division stinks. So, there's Jacksonville, but Houston's not going to be doing anything, right? And Indianapolis is still not well, Indianapolis is kind of a wild card. The point is Tennessee can contend in that division. And adding a guy like Hopkins, who I would say his major flaws the last 2 years have just been injury related, not what he is as a wide receiver. I heard you going over his stats. He's a really good player when healthy. So if you can put like 1,200 yards and 6 to 8 touchdowns there in the mix for them, that gives Ryan Tannehill a pretty reliable target. I think that they can be pretty competitive for at least a wild card spot, if not the division.
Well, if he could still play at the level that he did those last couple of years in Houston and his first year in Arizona, you got DeAndre Hopkins and Derrick Henry on the same team. So that's not bad. So
no, not bad at all. That should be good enough to be competitive in that division.
Are you getting like a ton of alerts? What's going on over there?
There must be something going. Yeah, I am getting alerts. I guess the whole franchise tag deadlines happens as we were speaking and all that. So
I was like, are people tweeting? Like, or are they hitting like the like button? Are they retweeting you? Like,
I'm just a very important person.
You're very popular today, Geoff Mosher at Geoff P. Mosher on Twitter. By the way, he'll be back on Wednesday, and we'll be less than a week to training camp when he returns on Football at 4. Thanks, buddy.
You got it, man. Talk to you Wednesday.
Good conversation with Geoff here on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN.